The roar of the MH-60L Blackhawk's rotors drowned out even my own thoughts as we raced over the endless inky sea of the Appalachian Mountains. The helicopter's vibration thrummed in my teeth, in my bones, in the very core of my being. Below, a primal world of folds and shadows spread out, a forest so dense it looked solid. Our target, Jeremiah Blackwood, a charismatic bastard who'd gathered a cult of outcasts somewhere in this wilderness. Intel was scarce. Satellite imagery showed only a vague cluster of structures, and rumors ranged from a drug lab to something more sinister, linked to the recent disappearances of hikers. A typical Delta Force job, a surgical strike into the heart of darkness. I, Sergeant Major Richter, scanned my team. 5 men, including myself, the best of the best. To my right, Sergeant First Class Doc Evans, our medic, his face under the helmet impassive as always, fingers methodically checking the contents of his pouch. To my left, Staff Sergeant Sparky Jones, comms specialist, fiddled with the secure terminal, his brow furrowed in concentration. Behind them, Sergeants Kowalski with his trusty M249 saw and Ghostly, our sniper, his eyes already scanning the darkness outside through the night vision scope of his MK-12. We were armed to the teeth, fully kitted HK 416 carbines, Glock 19 sidearms, grenades, latest gen NVGs, a fine-tuned, lethal machine. The chopper banked sharply, coming in for landing. The red light in the cabin switched to green. Go time. One by one, we slid down the thick ropes onto a small clearing hemmed in by a wall of trees. The damp, heavy air hit my face, smelling of leaf mold, wet earth, and something else. Wild, unfamiliar. The rotors kicked up a whirlwind of fallen leaves, and then the Black Hawk lifted off, its sound fading rapidly into the night, leaving us in a deafening silence. The isolation was palpable, like an invisible wall cutting us off from the rest of the world. Sparky deployed the antenna, establishing comms with base. The signal was weak but steady, for now. Gear check. Helmet lights cut narrow beams through the gloom, tree trunks like columns in an endless black temple. The forest breathed around us, but it wasn't the calming breath of nature. It was heavy, watchful. I pointed the way. We moved out, melting into the shadows, confident in our strength and training. We were predators on the hunt. A premonition, cold and sticky, stirred somewhere deep inside, but I pushed it away. Just the woods. Just another mission. We moved silently, like ghosts in a practiced wedge formation. NVGs painted the world in eerie green hues. The forest was strangely quiet. None of the usual nighttime chorus of insects, the occasional bird call, or the rustle of small animals. Only our own breathing, the soft swish of gear, and the dull thud of boots on damp earth. An hour in, maybe more. Lee on point froze, raising a hand. I moved up. In the wet mud, a track. Huge. 5-toed with deep claw impressions, but the shape was wrong for a grisly, too elongated, almost humanoid, if a human had claws the length of my knife. We exchanged glances. Kowalski shook his head in disbelief. Some local mutant? Or a hoax by the cultists? We pressed on, the tension mounting. Soon, the tracks became more frequent. And not just tracks. About 8 feet up the trunk of a thick oak, the bark was shredded as if raked by a giant blade. Wood chips littered the ground. No animal I knew could do that. Then we stumbled upon the remains of a deer. Or what was left of it. It wasn't eaten, but literally torn apart with inhuman strength. Chunks of flesh and fur hung from branches. Blood soaked the ground around it. Nearby lay a primitive trap. A snare made of rawhide, tied to a sapling bent with incredible force. Carved into the snare itself was a crude symbol like a spiral with spikes. This didn't fit the profile of drug runners anymore. Sparky muttered something under his breath, checking motion sensors. Nothing. But Lee froze again, his rifle slowly panning right up the slope. I followed his gaze through my own NVG's, thermal signature. Large. It flickered between the trees and vanished. Too fast for a man or a bear, like a blurred heat smudge dissolving into the dark. What was that? I asked silently, using hand signals. Lee shrugged, his face unreadable beneath the helmet, but I saw his fingers tighten on the trigger. The atmosphere grew thick. Rational explanations were fraying at the edges. Had the air gotten colder, or was it just fear starting to creep under my body armor? We checked our weapons, flicked safeties off. Whatever waited ahead, it wasn't what we'd prepped for. The forest was no longer just woods. It was hostile territory, and we felt unseen, hungry eyes on us. The target wasn't a camp or settlement in the usual sense. No tents, no barracks. Instead, a chaotic cluster of crude log and stone huts built around a low, moss-covered stone mound that looked unnaturally ancient for this region. In the center of the mound stood a roughly hewn stone, like an altar, blackened with soot and something else that looked like dried blood. The air here was heavy, thick with the smell of rot, smoke, and that same wild, musky stench we'd caught back at the LZ, and the scent of fresh blood. It led to one of the huts. The door was ripped off its hinges. Inside, illuminated by our weapon lights, was a horrific scene. Human remains, not just killed, ritually mutilated. Bones broken at unnatural angles, flesh torn away in strips, the same spiral symbols carved into the skin we'd seen on the snare. Primitive stone knives and axes lay nearby. This wasn't a drug cult. This was something far worse. Suddenly, the world exploded into motion and sound. From the darkness between the huts, from the woods all around, shadows lunged at us. Huge, incredibly fast figures moving on two legs, but hunched over, covered in thick, dark fur. Their eyes burned yellow in our lights. Predatory fire. These weren't men in costumes. This was something else. Primal, furious. The fight erupted instantly without warning. We opened fire. The chatter of HK-416S tore through the night air. 5.56 mm rounds hit home, ripping through fur and flesh, but the creatures barely seemed to notice. They kept coming, ignoring wounds that should have stopped a bull. One of the figures slammed into Kowalski before he could bring his saw to bear. I heard a sickening crunch and a scream that cut off with a gurgle. Kowalski flew sideways like a rag doll, his machine gun clattering uselessly against the stones. We were firing at near point-blank range. I saw rounds punch into the chest of one creature, leaving bloody holes, but it just roared, a low, guttural sound full of primal hate, and swiped with a monstrously clawed hand. I barely dodged back, the claws slashing the air where my head had been. Lee was clinical. 2 precise shots from his MK-12 to the head of the nearest beast. The skull cracked. The creature collapsed, but even falling, it tried to claw at us. Evans covered our retreat toward the center of the clearing, firing short bursts. Jones frantically worked the radio. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The remaining creatures, 2 or 3, fell back, melting into the forest darkness as quickly as they had appeared. We were left alone amidst the carnage, breathing heavily, adrenaline surging. Kowalski was dead, his body mangled beyond recognition. Evans knelt beside him but just shook his head. We looked at each other. Shock, horror, disbelief. These weren't human, and our weapons, they weren't working like they should. We were trapped. The silence after the firefight pressed harder on my ears than the roar of the rifles. We stood in the center of that damned ritual site, surrounded by the stench of blood and death. Kowalski's body lay in a grotesque heap at my feet. Doc Evans finished a quick assessment. Instantaneous death, multiple fractures, massive internal trauma. He covered the remains with a jacket. Doc's face was pale even in the greenish NVG light. Jones, our Sparky, was frantically working the radio. "Nothing, Sergeant Major." His voice was hoarse, strained. "Dead air. Either they're jamming us or this valley's just a damn black hole for signals." I looked up at the sky. The moon, nearly full, broke through ragged clouds, bathing the clearing in a deathly pale silvery light. It wasn't comforting. It amplified the surreal horror, turning the familiar world into an alien and hostile landscape. Dawn was still a long way off. 6 hours at least. 6 hours in hell with creatures that shrugged off bullets. We had to move. Staying here was suicide. I pointed southeast towards the presumed extraction point. It was our only chance. "Move out." "Lee, your point. Doc, rear guard. Sparky, you're with me. Drop non-essentials. Ammo, water, medkit only." My mind raced, trying to build a new plan from the wreckage of the old one. These things, they were fast, strong, incredibly resilient. Regeneration? Or just a monstrous tolerance for pain and damage? Their tactics, sudden ambush, overwhelming speed and strength, then retreat before we could mount an effective defense. They knew the woods. We didn't. We picked up Kowalski's saw without our machine gunner. Our firepower was drastically reduced. We had to leave the body. A bitter taste filled my mouth. We don't leave our own behind, but the choice now was between carrying our dead comrade and surviving ourselves. We moved out, sticking to the shadows, constantly scanning the woods around us. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. The forest was no longer a neutral backdrop. It was full of eyes burning yellow in the dark. Moonlight filtering through the canopy created dancing patterns of light and shadow that played tricks on the eyes, making us see movement where there was none. Paranoia began to erode discipline. We knew they were out there, watching, waiting, hunting us now. The sense of total isolation was almost physical. We were cut off, alone, and there would be no backup until dawn. The chopper wasn't coming. Just us, the woods, the moon, and them. The forest became a labyrinth of terror. We moved quickly but cautiously, trying to leave no trace, make no noise. But they were everywhere. We didn't see them, but we felt their presence. A rustle in the bushes to the right, a branch cracking to the left, a swift flicker of shadow at the edge of vision. They were toying with us, herding us like a wolf pack harrying a deer. The first attack after leaving the camp was swift and brutal. A shadow launched itself from a tree directly onto our rear guard, Doc Evans. He managed to turn and fire, but the creature was already on him. There was a short scream, the sound of tearing fabric and flesh. Lee and I opened up with suppressive fire. The creature shrieked, recoiled from Doc's fallen body, and vanished into the undergrowth before we could get a clear shot. Doc was dead. Claws had ripped open his throat and chest. 3 of us left: Richter, Lee, Jones. Panic began seeping through the armor of our training. I saw it in Jones's eyes, dilated pupils, ragged breathing. Lee remained outwardly calm, but his movements were sharper, his head constantly swiveling, his finger never leaving the trigger. We fell back, covering each other, trying to stick to more open ground where ambush was less likely. Useless. They used the forest itself as a weapon. We tried setting M18 Claymore mines on our back trail. One went off. The explosion ripped through the silence, followed by a furious roar. But when we cautiously circled back to check, we found only clumps of dark fur and splashes of dark blood on the trees. No bodies. Either they dragged the wounded one away, or the wounds were already closing. The thought of regeneration was nauseating. How do you fight something you can't kill conventionally? We changed tactics. Short rushes from cover to cover. Suppressive fire into likely ambush spots. Flashbangs tossed into the darkness brought only momentary confusion and enraged howls. They adapted quickly. On one tree we passed, I noticed a freshly carved symbol, the same spiked spiral, but inside it was a crude depiction of the moon and a drop of blood. Occult shit, it was obvious now. We weren't dealing with just mutants or an unknown species. This was something ancient dark, tied to these woods, to the moon. We got lost, circling in the unfamiliar terrain, the compass seeming to spin erratically near certain rock formations. Jones stumbled, fell. Before Lee or I could react, something huge and dark burst from the bushes, grabbed him and dragged him into the thicket with incredible speed. His scream was cut off almost instantly. Two left, me and Lee. Two elite soldiers against a pack of seemingly invincible creatures in their home territory. The hunters had definitively become the hunted. Lee and I ran. Tactics dissolved, leaving only the raw instinct for survival. Our pursuers were close behind, their heavy breathing and snarls audible just yards away. The forest blurred past in the green glow of the NVGs. Ahead, at the base of a low cliff face, I spotted a dark opening, a cave entrance. "In there!" I yelled, even though I knew bottling ourselves up was a tactical mistake. But the open woods had become a death trap. Maybe in the cave, we could make a stand. We stumbled inside, gasping for breath, and spun around, weapons trained on the entrance. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust, mold, and something else, sickly sweet. The smell of old death. As our eyes adjusted, we swept our lights around. The cave wasn't deep, but it was reasonably spacious. And it was filled with bones, human and animal, jumbled together in a macabre chaos. Skulls with empty sockets stared at us from all sides. In the far end of the cave, there was a kind of altar made of rough stones, covered in the same spiral symbols and dark stains. On the walls, primitive paintings, done in ochre, and it looked like blood. Depictions of enormous wolves standing on their hind legs, tearing humans apart under a huge full moon. There were also drawings of humans transforming into these creatures. An ancient story told in pictures on stone. This place was their shrine, or their lair. In a corner amidst the bones, I noticed something else. A hiker's backpack, half-rotted but recognizable. Beside it, a small leather-bound notebook, waterlogged and moldy. I picked it up carefully. The pages were stuck together, but some entries were still legible. A trembling hand told the story of a lost hiker named David Miller, who'd been searching for local legends about wolf men. He wrote about strange sounds at night, huge tracks, the feeling of being watched. The last entries were made in this cave. He described the creatures, saw their rituals under the full moon, their connection to this place. He mentioned their vulnerability to silver, an old legend, but he wrote it as fact, something he'd possibly tested by fending one off with a silver dinner knife. And he wrote about fire. They feared fire. We had no silver, not a single silver bullet or knife, but fire. We had lighters, a little fuel for a camp stove we hadn't brought, and a couple of M14 incendiary grenades. It was a chance. A slim, desperate chance. Outside, a howl erupted close. They'd found us. The hunt was nearing its end. Here, in this sanctuary of bones, we would make our last stand. The howling outside grew louder, shifting into low, menacing growls. They had the cave surrounded. Shadows flickered at the entrance, huge silhouettes against the slightly lightening pre-dawn sky. Lee and I took positions on either side of the narrow opening, using piles of bones as makeshift cover. Ammo was critically low, 3 mags each for the carbines, a couple of grenades, sidearms, and the 2 M14 incendiary grenades, our only ace. "Fire is the play," I rasped to Lee, gesturing at the dry twigs and moss we'd dragged near the entrance. "Keep 'em back as long as we can. On my command, incendiaries." Lee nodded, his face a mask of concentration, but his eyes held the understanding. This was the end of the line, one way or another. The first creature poked its head into the cave, massive, covered in jet-black fur, with burning yellow eyes and a fanged maw. We opened fire simultaneously. Rounds slammed into its face. The creature howled in pain and rage, recoiling. But others were already pushing in behind it. They weren't charging blindly anymore, learning from their losses. They were smarter now, probing, testing our defenses one by one. Fire from the HK 416S drove them back, but they kept coming. The wounds we inflicted seemed irrelevant. Blood sprayed, but they pressed on. One lunged far enough to swipe with a paw. Claws screeched on the rock next to my head, showering me with dust. I emptied the rest of my mag into its head at point-blank range. It collapsed, twitching, but the next one was already scrambling over its body. Carbine ammo was gone. "Now!" I yelled. We pulled the pins and tossed the incendiary grenades toward the entrance. The thermite ignited with a searing hiss, flooding the narrow passage with blindingly white, roaring flame. Creatures caught too close shrieked in unbearable agony, their fur erupting in fire. The stench of burning flesh and hair hit us. The fire created a barrier, but not for long. Thermite burns fiercely but quickly. We switched to sidearms. The Glock felt like a toy after the carbine. One creature, wreathed in flames, kept crawling forward, a living torch. Lee put it down with a shot to the head. And then he appeared. The one we'd been sent for. Jeremiah Blackwood. Or what he had become. He was larger than the others, his fur streaked with gray, his eyes burning not yellow but red. He didn't charge into the fire. He stood at the entrance, intelligence gleaming in his eyes, cold and cruel. He threw back his head and let out a long, drawn-out howl. And then the cave roof above us began to crack. They were coming from above through fissures in the rock we hadn't seen. One creature dropped down right behind Lee. I heard his short cry, the sounds of a struggle, then silence. I was alone. Blackwood stepped through the dying thermite, ignoring the flames. He walked straight towards me. Pistol rounds only made him flinch. I threw the useless Glock aside, drew my K-bar combat knife, hopeless, but I wasn't dying without a fight. He lunged, primal fury against a soldier's desperation. I don't remember the details of the fight. Only animal rage. The smell of blood. His and mine. The sting of claws tearing through body armor and flesh, the crunch of bone. I remember plunging my K-bar into his eye socket again and again, until he roared and staggered back. I remember him hitting me, sending me slamming against the cave wall. The world went dark. When I came to, the first rays of dawn were filtering through the cracks in the cave roof, illuminating the carnage. The cave was littered with bodies my team and them. But their bodies looked strange. The fur was receding, features distorting. They seemed to be melting, dissolving into something shapeless, rapidly decomposing. Blackwood's body at my feet had already lost most of its bestial features, becoming the mangled corpse of a man in tattered clothes. No proof, nothing to show command, just my word and my wounds. I lay among the bones and decaying remains, badly injured, broken ribs searing with every breath, arm dislocated, my whole body a mass of lacerations and bruises. Lee lay nearby, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Dead. All dead. Except me. The forest was quiet. The morning light, which should have brought salvation, felt cold and indifferent. It illuminated the horror, but didn't dispel it. It just made it visible. I heard a distant, growing rumble. A helicopter. Extraction. They'd come after all. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out. I could only push myself up on one elbow, staring at the cave entrance. Rescuers in full gear appeared in the opening, their faces contorting in horror at the scene. One rushed to me, starting first aid. I tried to speak, to explain, but only a hoarse croak came out. The world started to fade again. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was a beam of sunlight falling on the ancient altar in the center of the cave, where the dark bloodstains and the carved spiral were still visible. The secret remained here, in the heart of the forest. Hospital. White walls, the smell of antiseptic, the beep of machines. Weeks of recovery. The physical wounds healed slowly but surely. Broken bones mended, lacerations became scars. But the scars on my mind ran deeper. The official report stated, encounter with an unexpectedly large and well-armed group of local extremists, possibly linked to a drug cartel. Combat under difficult mountainous and forested conditions. Casualties: 4 operators, KIA, Sergeant Major Richter. Sole survivor, severely wounded. Mission failure. No further mention of Jeremiah Blackwood or his cult. My attempts to tell the truth about the massive creatures, the regeneration, the occult symbols, the cave of bones, were met with either polite disbelief from doctors, who attributed it all to combat shock and PTSD, or the cold silence of my superiors during classified debriefings. You're tired, Richter. You need rest. They didn't want to believe or couldn't. Or maybe they knew more than they let on. I was medically discharged, with honors, with medals for valor, but effectively blacklisted. The hero who saw too much and talked too much. I went home, but home wasn't there anymore. I flinched at every noise in the night. The woods outside my window no longer looked peaceful. I saw shadows between the trees, and the moonlight, it became my personal nightmare. Every full moon I couldn't sleep, just sat by the window with a loaded shotgun, waiting. For what? For them to come for me, or for the shadow inside me to awaken. I often handled the only thing I'd managed to discreetly pocket from that cave. A small blackened shard of stone from the altar, bearing part of the spiral symbol. It felt cold, but sometimes, under the moonlight, I thought I felt it grow warm. I don't know what truly happened in those Appalachian woods. Was it a unique event? Or does an ancient evil still lurk there, waiting for the next full moon? I only know one thing. The world isn't what it seems, and there are shadows that no dawn can ever truly banish. They live in the woods, and they live in my mind. Forever. Story 2. Olympic National Park. The gray, ever-present Washington drizzle drummed on the roof of our old Ford Explorer as we turned off Highway 101 toward the entrance of Olympic National Park. The air smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and the promise of adventure. Exactly what we needed. tired of Seattle's urban sprawl. Lauren, my wife, nervously fiddled with the silver pendant around her neck. A Celtic knot she believed was a protective charm. Her superstitions always seemed like a cute quirk to me, but today they felt different. Before the trip, she'd insisted I bring my old Remington 870 hunting shotgun, which usually gathered dust in the safe. "Just in case, James," she'd said. "You never know in places this wild." 3-year-old Ethan slept soundly in his car seat in the back, oblivious to his mother's anxiety. At the entrance station, we weren't greeted by the usual young, smiling intern, but by a stocky man in his 50s with a weathered face and deep-set eyes. The patch on his uniform read, "Ranger T. Wilson." He approached the car slowly, his gaze sweeping over the park sticker on the windshield, then lingering on me, on Lauren, and seeming to pause for a moment on sleeping Ethan. "Welcome to Olympic," he said in a flat, almost lifeless voice. "Planning on staying long?" I explained we were heading to the Hoh River campground for a couple of nights, hoping to show our son the famous mossy rainforests. Wilson nodded, but his eyes remained cold. Hoh River. Beautiful place. Wild. He paused, tapping his fingers on a clipboard. "Listen, Carter," he lowered his voice, leaning toward the window. "Be vigilant, especially at night. Stick to lighted areas, stay on trails after sunset, and..." He hesitated as if searching for the right words. "Watch your boy very closely." His tone lacked the usual ranger pleasantries. It held undisguised weariness and something else, almost fear. "Animals are acting unusual this year," he added, straightening up. "Be careful." He waved us through, his figure quickly disappearing into the misting rain. Lauren clutched her pendant tighter. "I don't like the way he looked, James," she whispered. I tried to brush it off, blaming it on a tough job and bad weather. But the ranger's strange warning settled unpleasantly in my gut. The road ahead vanished into thick fog, hiding an ancient forest that felt not just old, but watchful. The Hoh River campground greeted us with a majestic silence, broken only by the rush of the river and the calls of unseen birds. Giant Sitka spruce and western hemlock, draped in thick blankets of moss, created a fairy tale, otherworldly atmosphere. We chose a secluded spot near the river, away from the few other tents. While I set up our large family tent, Lauren prepared lunch, and Ethan delightedly chased butterflies in a small meadow. The weather had cleared slightly, rare sunbeams filtering through the canopy, but the air remained damp and cool. Later, walking along the river, we chatted with an elderly couple from Oregon camped nearby. The man, Bill, enthusiastically talked about fishing, but his wife Martha looked worried. "Have you heard anything strange at night?" she asked in a hushed voice, when Bill stepped away to get tackle from their car. Lauren immediately tensed. Martha explained that the previous night they were woken by terrifying sounds, something between branches snapping and a high-pitched, piercing cry unlike any animal she knew. "And then this morning we couldn't find our beagle Patches," she added, barely holding back tears. "He always slept by the tent entrance on his leash. The leash was just cut or bitten through by something incredibly sharp. No sign of a struggle, nothing." Bill returned, and catching the end of the conversation, frowned. "Nonsense, Martha. Probably a coyote or a cougar. And the sounds, it's the forest, you hear all sorts of things." But his voice lacked conviction. He added that he'd heard tales from other hikers about missing livestock from nearby farms, and even about a tourist who vanished without a trace last fall, somewhere deep in the park. I tried to remain skeptical. A missing dog, sad but explainable. A weird cry, wind in the trees, or a distant predator. Rumors of disappearances, common for vast wilderness areas. Locals love scaring tourists, I told Lauren as we walked back to our tent. Forest legends, nothing more. But Martha's words and Bill's uneasy expression stuck with me. I checked the shotgun's load and placed it inside the tent near our sleeping bags. Lauren nodded silently, her face pale. Evening drew in, shadows deepening beneath the giant trees, and the forest's silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt oppressive, filled with a vague menace. Even Ethan grew quiet, clinging to Lauren and pointing a finger into the darkening woods, muttering something indistinct about big eyes. The next morning, after a restless night filled with rustles and wind howls that now seemed sinister, we decided to take a short walk on one of the marked trails leading deeper into the rainforest. The sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy, creating a dappled play of light and shadow on ferns and mossy trunks. Ethan rode on my shoulders, gazing up curiously at the enormous trees. Lauren walked beside me, slightly calmer in the daylight, but still casting wary glances around. For the first half hour, the hike was wonderful. The air was clean and fresh, birds sang, a nearby stream burbled. We savored the peace and beauty of the primeval nature. And then we smelled it, a heavy, metallic scent of blood hanging in the still air. It grew stronger as we followed the trail. Around a bend, nestled among giant ferns, we saw the source. In a small clearing lay the carcass of a large Roosevelt elk, or what remained of it. The sight was horrifying. The animal had been literally torn apart with inhuman force. Ribs were snapped and jutted outwards like shipwreck debris. Huge chunks of flesh were ripped away, entrails scattered across the moss. This wasn't the work of a cougar or a bear. I'd seen enough of their kills. Predators kill to eat. They are efficient, but this displayed a kind of frenzied, senseless violence. The ground around the carcass was trampled, but not by ordinary animal tracks. I cautiously approached, leaving Lauren and Ethan back. The prints in the soft, damp earth were huge, much larger than a bear's and strangely elongated, with deep impressions of something like claws or hooves. But not deer or elk hooves. They were too narrow, too sharp. And the stride length. It was unnaturally long, as if the creature that left them moved in giant leaps or had incredibly long legs. Some tracks led directly to the elk's remains. Others plunged into the impassable thicket, snapping thick branches at a height no normal animal could reach. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't any predator I knew. This was something else. Something wrong. I looked back at Lauren. Her face was white as a sheet, her eyes wide with terror. She silently pointed to the trunk of a nearby spruce. About 8 feet up, deep gouges scarred the bark, as if something huge and powerful had raked it with sharp claws. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's get out of here. Right now." I grabbed Ethan, who had started to whimper, sensing our fear, and we practically ran back towards the campsite, constantly looking over our shoulders. The forest's beauty had vanished instantly, replaced by primal dread. Now it felt like something was watching from behind every tree. Back at the campsite, we couldn't shake the feeling of panic. The image of the mutilated elk and the strange tracks haunted us. Lauren was on the verge of hysterics, begging me to leave immediately. I was scared shitless too, but I tried to keep it together for her and Ethan. Leaving now at dusk on an unfamiliar forest road didn't seem wise. "We'll stay the night, pack up first thing in the morning, and leave," I said firmly, trying to sound confident. "We'll lock ourselves in the tent. We have the shotgun. Everything will be fine." I built a large campfire, hoping the flames would deter whatever beast might be out there. We ate dinner in near silence, listening to every sound. Ethan fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the day's events. As soon as it was dark, we retreated into the tent, zipping everything tightly. I placed the loaded Remington next to my sleeping bag. Lauren lay with her eyes wide open, clutching her pendant. The night was dark and moonless. The campfire slowly died down, casting ever weaker, dancing shadows. The surrounding forest came alive with myriad night sounds, snapping twigs, an owl's hoot, the distant rush of the river. But cutting through this familiar symphony were other disturbing notes. Somewhere deep in the woods, that same high-pitched, drawn-out cry Martha had described echoed. It was closer than last night. Lauren flinched and pressed against me. I gripped the shotgun tighter, my heart pounding. The hours crawled by agonizingly slowly. I must have dozed off but was jolted awake by another sound. A soft, whimpering cry, like a baby's. It came from somewhere very close, just beyond the trees at the edge of our clearing. "Ethan?" Lauren whispered, sitting up. But our son was sleeping soundly between us. The cry came again, thin and plaintive. It sounded so helpless, so enticing. Despite the fear, something compelled me to carefully unzip the tent flap and peer out. The campfire embers still glowed, providing a faint reddish light. And in that uncertain light, I saw it. It stood at the edge of the woods, partly hidden by the shadow of a giant spruce. At first I thought it was a deer, but then I realized my mistake. The creature was impossibly tall and emaciated. Its grayish skin stretched taut over protruding ribs. Its limbs were unnaturally long and spindly, ending in something like cloven hooves, or claws that dug deep into the earth. Its head resembled a deer skull, but with empty, dark sockets where glowing red pinpricks of light flickered. It slowly turned its head towards me, and I saw rows of needle-sharp teeth in its elongated jaw. The crying stopped. It just stood there watching me. Terror froze me, but self-preservation kicked in. I raised the shotgun and, barely aiming, pulled the trigger. The deafening blast tore through the night's silence. I expected the creature to fall, or at least stagger, but it didn't even flinch. It just kept standing there, wreathed in gunpowder smoke as if the buckshot had passed right through it, harmlessly. The silence after the shot rang in my ears. The creature stood motionless, shrouded in powder smoke and the faint glow of the embers. Its empty sockets with their red lights were fixed right on me. I fumbled to reload the shotgun, my hand shaking so badly the shell almost slipped to the ground. I was ready to fire again, but then it spoke. The voice wasn't human. A dry, rustling whisper that seemed to originate not from its mouth but directly inside my head. It was full of ancient malice and hunger. "Children," the voice hissed, drawing out the word. "So tender, so sweet. Your child will soon be mine." The whisper was worse than any scream. It crawled under my skin, chilled my blood, paralyzed my will. I wanted to yell, to shoot again, but I couldn't move, choked by a wave of irrational terror. Just then, Lauren's piercing scream came from inside the tent. It snapped me out of my stupor. I whipped around. Lauren was sitting bolt upright in her sleeping bag, her face a mask of horror, staring at the empty space beside her where Ethan had been sleeping just a minute ago. "James, Ethan, he's gone. Oh God, he's gone." She frantically patted the sleeping bag, the blanket as if hoping he was just hiding. But he wasn't there. The tent was intact. The flap I had unzipped was the only way out. But Ethan had vanished, without a trace. I scrambled towards her, my heart plummeting into an abyss. The empty sleeping bag, the small pillow with the imprint of his head, his favorite teddy bear lying on its side. But no Ethan. The creature's whisper echoed in my ears, "Will soon be mine." I looked out of the tent again. The creature at the tree line was gone. Only dark trees and silence, now broken only by Lauren's desperate sobs. The realization crashed down on me with its full, monstrous weight. Our son, our little Ethan, gone. Taken by that nightmarish thing right from under our noses. Guilt, fear, helplessness, grief, it all swirled into an unbearable cocktail. I looked at Lauren, consumed by grief, at the empty sleeping bag, at the dark, hostile forest around us. The world swam. My knees buckled. The last thing I remember is Lauren's tear-streaked face and a deafening roar in my ears, as if the river's sound had become the roar of hell itself. And then, darkness. Both Lauren and I just passed out, unable to bear the nightmare. Consciousness returned slowly, reluctantly, through a haze of headache and nausea. The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was the gray morning sky through the spruce branches and the concerned face of Ranger Wilson leaning over me. Another, younger ranger with a M. Ross name tag bustled nearby. I was lying on the ground next to our tent, wrapped in a sleeping bag. Lauren sat nearby on a camp chair, bundled in a blanket, her gaze empty and distant. Someone had already given her hot tea from a thermos. Last night's memories flooded back, the cry, the creature, the whisper, the empty sleeping bag. "Ethan," I croaked. Wilson put a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Easy, Mr. Carter. We know. We've already started the search." The younger ranger, Michael Ross, looked shaken and bewildered. He asked me the standard questions. When did we last see our son? What was he wearing? Any distinguishing features? I answered mechanically, my brain refusing to fully accept reality. I told them everything. The mutilated elk, the strange tracks, the creature at the tree line, the gunshot, the whisper. Ross took notes, shaking his head, his face a mixture of disbelief and pity. But Wilson... He listened silently, and there was no surprise in his eyes. Only grim weariness and recognition. When I mentioned the creature resembling a deer with long limbs, he just pressed his lips together tightly. Soon more rangers arrived, along with state troopers and volunteers with search dogs. A large-scale search operation began. They combed the woods, calling Ethan's name. The dogs picked up a scent, but quickly lost it right at the edge of the forest, where I had seen the creature. They became agitated, whining and cowering near their handlers. I wanted desperately to join the search, pacing the campsite, peering into the thicket, but Wilson firmly stopped me. "You and your wife are better off staying here, or going to the station. We need you for information, not running around the woods in shock." He was right, but sitting idle was unbearable. Watching the rangers, I became increasingly convinced that Wilson knew far more than he was saying. He gave orders crisply, but with a sort of resigned finality. Once I overheard a fragment of his conversation with Ross when they stood slightly apart, thinking I couldn't hear. "Check the old abandoned mine near Bear Creek," Wilson said quietly. "And be extremely careful, Michael. It's getting bolder. Much bolder than before." Ross paled but nodded. Bolder? So this had happened before? My fear mixed with anger. They knew something dangerous lived in these woods, and did nothing? The days blurred into an agonizing sequence of waiting and despair. The search continued but yielded nothing. No trace of Ethan, not a scrap of his clothing, not a single sign. It was as if our son had vanished into thin air. The forest, which had seemed so majestic just days before, now looked like a sinister, impenetrable wall, jealously guarding its secret. Lauren and I moved into a small guest room at the ranger station. Lauren barely spoke, sitting by the window for hours, staring at the darkening trees, her eyes filled with a pain that crushed my heart. I couldn't rest, constantly pestering Wilson and the other rangers with questions, poring over maps, trying to catch any hint in their conversations. Wilson remained reserved, but his tired eyes spoke volumes. He confirmed that unexplained disappearances, hikers, animals had happened in the park before. The official story was always got lost, accident, predator attack. But he admitted to me one quiet evening, when we were alone in his office that smelled of coffee and dampness, that some cases didn't fit any of those explanations. "There are things in these woods, James," he said, staring somewhere past the wall. "Older than the trees. Legends of the local tribes. They talk about a hungry spirit that comes in the cold, dark times. Wendigo, they call it, or something like it. We try not to believe, but sometimes..." He trailed off, but I understood. The creature I saw, its unnatural appearance, its whisper about children, it all aligned too well with the gruesome Native American myths. After 3 days of intensive searching, a team of county sheriff's deputies arrived, specifically called in to search the particularly rugged area where the old mine Wilson mentioned was supposedly located. They left in the morning determined, with dogs and specialized gear. They returned late that evening, and the sight of them shocked me. Of the 5 men, 2 were injured. One had his arm hastily bandaged with a blood-soaked cloth, the other limped heavily, supported by a colleague. Their faces were pale, almost gray, their eyes wide with witnessed horror. They walked past us silently, avoiding eye contact, and quickly disappeared into their vehicles. In response to Wilson's questions, their leader just snapped, "There's nothing there, and we're not going back." No explanations, no details. Their silence spoke louder than any words. What had they seen? What had they encountered in the darkness of the abandoned mine? The answer hung in the air, heavy and chilling. Ethan was lost. The search was officially called off the next day. There was no hope left. The official conclusion read, "Missing under undetermined circumstances." Empty words on paper that couldn't convey a fraction of our grief and horror. The search ended. Volunteers and police departed. Only Lauren and I remained, broken and hollowed out, along with the silent rangers who seemed to carry the burden of this cursed place. I had no doubt now, this forest was cursed. An ancient evil dwelled in its shadowed depths, the evil Wilson had warned about, the one tourists whispered about, the one that had torn apart the elk and taken our son. And it was my fault. I replayed the events of the past few days over and over in my mind. The ranger's warning I dismissed. Lauren's superstitions I'd scoffed at. Her pleas to leave that I'd rejected. My arrogance, my blind faith that we were safe, that a shotgun could protect us from anything. I had brought my family here, into the maw of the monster. The thought burned inside me, giving me no peace, day or night. I saw Ethan in every sunbeam breaking through the clouds, heard his laughter in the river's rush. Lauren sank into a deep depression, barely eating or speaking. We were shattered. Wilson helped us pack. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer condolences, just silently did what needed to be done. As we got into the car to leave this place forever, he came to my window. "I'm sorry, Carter," he said quietly. "Truly sorry. Some wounds never heal." In his eyes, I saw not only sympathy but also a deep old pain. How many other stories like ours did this forest hold? How many other families had it destroyed? We drove away from Olympic under the same gray, drizzling rain that had greeted us days ago. But now it felt not just dreary, but ominous. The forest watched us leave with a heavy, oppressive silence. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Among the dark tree trunks, for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a tall, emaciated figure with a deer skull for a head. I snapped my head back. Nothing. But the feeling that we were being watched, that something malevolent and hungry was following us, stayed with me all the way back to Seattle. We had left the forest, but had we taken its curse with us? Or had it simply let us go, knowing we were already broken and awaited its next victim? Months passed. Late autumn painted the forests of Olympic National Park in hues of crimson and gold. The rains grew colder, the fogs thicker. A shiny minivan with California plates pulled up to the park entrance. A smiling man sat behind the wheel, his wife beside him, gazing in awe at the majestic trees. In the back seat, two small children chattered excitedly, anticipating adventures in the wilderness. At the entrance station, they were greeted by a young ranger with tired eyes, Michael Ross. He handed them a map, gave the standard warnings about wildlife, and asked them to stay on the trails. His voice lacked the strange urgency Wilson's had held that summer. Perhaps he had resigned himself, or perhaps he was simply tired of warning those who wouldn't listen. The minivan disappeared around the bend, carrying the unsuspecting family deep into the ancient forest. And there, in the dense shade of the centuries-old spruce, where the air smelled of dampness and decay, something watched silently. An ancient hunger, insatiable and patient, stirred once more. The shadow of Olympic waited for its new guests, waited for the innocent, so tender, so sweet.